All right, thank you for the intro. Josh, I see the two of us are both brave souls that are both in an office today or
Yes.
possibly an airport lounge. I know that you were traveling.
Yeah, no, I'm actually in our Charlotte. Well, we're headquartered in Charlotte, and so I came to the office today, and I've got this room with a decent background. But just so the brand innovator people to know, I'm trying to find that virtual background you sent me. Just for the record, I'm trying to comply with what you said to me to do.
Same. Awesome. Well, thought that the two of us could start to get into it. So I'm Josh Lustgarten from Textnow. We're a free phone service supported by advertising. I was brought on board to Textnow roughly 2 years ago. One, to further scale the sales org, but two, and why we're here today, because a big piece of the mission really came with solidifying and growing our data strategy. As we start to think about a world without cookies, without these device identifiers and whatnot. So I am joined by Josh Palau, someone that we're all lucky to have here today to discuss this strategy and discuss data. Josh, first, congrats on the new role at LendingTree. I know you're just over a month in, so that's exciting stuff. You're now back on the client side. You have some pretty heavy hitting roles on the agency side. We'll speak to that and we'll talk more about what you're doing on the LendingTree. But before we get into everything, thought you might want to take a quick moment and introduce yourself to the group.
Yeah, thanks. And thanks, Brand Innovators, again, for having me. Thanks, Josh, for being the host. So I'm Josh, as it said on the agenda. I just joined LendingTree as the SVP of Growth Marketing and Media. For those of you who may or may not know much about LendingTree, it's always been this company that's been focused on really helping consumers get the right decisions made for their financials, lots of financial decisions, be it a home loan, a personal loan, a business loan, credit cards. It was always really, positioned. It's a 24-year-old company. So in the grand scheme of things, not terribly old, considering I've worked for companies that have been around for hundreds of years. But what's really interesting is as the consumers changed and as the model and this whole sort of world is changing around us, specifically in the world of finance, the mission is now becoming a lot more around how do we educate consumers to make the smartest financial decisions? How do we help the consumer, frankly, win? We just launched our first in a really long time TV campaign yesterday around this whole positioning. We have a new CMO that joined earlier this year, Shiv Singh, who many people know. Shiv and I worked together years ago at Razorfish, but we're trying to take the company from what has been historically direct response focused, lead aggregation, to also incorporate brand, because what we've learned is brands matter. And I think for a while there, our industry sort of wasn't sure how much that mattered, but I do think brands matter, and I do think there's something that people think about when they have a trust, especially with a decision like this. And so I'm really excited to take over these channels. It's a mix of search, display, programmatic, native, media partnerships. So a real big sort of group of tactics and channels that I've had a lot of experience with.
Awesome. Excited to hear more. Today, we'll be talking about data, adapting to a data-deprived future, which kind of vague, but we'd love to kind of hear your thoughts on that, and what that means for people on both sides of the ball. So one side being the marketers, other side being the publishers. And it's funny, Josh, when the two of us were doing our prep, we actually started to talk about what does this mean? Are there certain types of marketers this is going to hurt more than others? And your response to me was actually, at a high level, this is not changing, right? It's the same thing that we've been doing for the last 50 or 60 years. There's just a bit less personalization. So with that, and before we get into it, I thought that we would structure today's conversation into a pair of pieces. First half, why don't we talk about where we are currently with data and data governance and the ways that the two of us use it. Second half, we'll talk about the data-deprived future. So what do we think is going to happen? What's the plan B? And how are you advising your clients, and how are you building out your client infrastructure?
Yep.
That sound good?
Sounds great.
Awesome. And we'll leave about 5 to 10 minutes at the end of this for questions from the group. So if you have questions, please just type it into the chat bot. So why don't we start, Josh? Let's talk about you. Let's talk about your experience. Let's talk about some things that you told me you enjoy. So you enjoy building. You enjoy putting processes in place. And if you look at your resume, you pick some pretty big name brands, some pretty big name agencies that really had the right pieces. You just didn't think that they were being put together in the right way. So why don't we start with that?
Yeah, I mean, so there's a couple of things, and I do think as I often try to do with these kinds of setups, like, hopefully everybody gathers like some piece of information outside of my general rambling on things that you could pull out. But I do think over my career, looking at all the companies I've worked at, there's consistencies with all of them. And so where you and I were talking about and how I think it relates here is that when a lot of the struggles that companies run into are things that they put in place, either like how they manage their processes, either with marketing, how they manage their agencies, how they manage their internal resources, what they do from a data perspective. And the challenge with all of that is like the provocative statement one, the consumer doesn't care. The consumer doesn't care that you have a performance marketing team and a brand marketing team and then a search team that sort of does something with affiliates. Like they don't care. Like they have a need. Hopefully you serve that need. They want to make a meaningful connection with you. And then, or hopefully actually you want to make a meaningful connection with them to drive the result you want to drive. And that doesn't mean that you have to live in a world of pure performance. But I think what I've always sort of gravitated towards is that every piece of your marketing channel has to perform. So years and years and years ago, performance marketing was born. It was typically search agencies with this idea that like that was about performance. And what I always remember when that happened was so many people who were working really hard on really tough client topics and really hard media channels saying, wait, I perform. Like, what do you mean performance media is only search or it's only programmatic? And so my point is that every part of your marketing channel has to perform. It just performs differently and it has to be measured differently in that way. So a lot of what I have spent time with organizations is figuring out like where we're spending our money, what's the desired outcome, and then sort of where do we go from there? So when you think specifically about LendingTree and what we just did, when we just launched a TV campaign, and we've got tons of data and tons of attribution, and we have lots of first-party data that we look at and measure and optimize. It's a very well-run machine. This TV campaign, it doesn't fit into that measurement machine that we've had because it's different ways that you measure it. And there's different, actually, there's different outcomes you're looking, right? Like we're trying to raise awareness, we're trying to gain trust, we're trying to reach a broader consumer, we're trying to reach more consumers. And so I just think that one of the traps that companies fall into is trying to measure everything against what it's always supposed to be, right? Like it's always MTA, so we're only going to measure against MTA. It's always media mix modeling, so we have to measure everything that way. And I just think that becomes really cumbersome and harder to make those kinds of quick decisions that you need when you're bucketed that way.
Okay, so a quick follow-up question there. You talk about performance and how the focus of television is to drive top of funnel. Is it fair or unfair when you think about digital media, because that's where search is, that's where typically social is, has digital turned into just a performance vehicle, or is there a place for branding?
Oh, there's absolutely a place for branding. I mean, you can like if you think about a lot of the brands, and it's funny, I bring up Peloton because everybody brings up Peloton, but like forget about all the crap they're going through now. But like when you think of brands that were born more to the D2C brands, whether they were Bombas or Bonobos or Peloton or all these other ones, I mean, there are some really solid brands that were born digitally. So I believe wholeheartedly, especially given the way the consumption patterns are changing, and you kind of throw connected TV sort of into digital, but it's really not the same as digital. But there's absolutely ways to build brands just using digital channels. I believe that wholeheartedly because I think it's pretty like, I mean, if you think about it, traditional marketing, and for those of you who are old enough to have gone through traditional marketing classes, it's like the building of a brand is again, it's about solving this problem. It's about meeting this need of a consumer. It's about making that connection. Ultimately, it's about, how do I win over somebody else? So why is my product better than my competitor's product? Like and when I say this is the reason to believe for our product, can anybody else say that? And so I think you can make that message using a nice combination of search, of video, of display banners, like all of those things coming together, I think are a way to pull that. And I do think to that sort of, I think where you were headed is like, I do think that's become a bit of the downside to digital at times is it gets put in this bucket of direct response, or it gets put into this bucket of performance in a, like, what are we measuring? What are we measuring? And so I think for so many companies who have struggled with shifting that media mix of like how they spend, I think it's for that reason. Right, you're used to saying like, well, we have to drive this awareness and TV reaches the most people. And, look, digital is only there for sales and for conversions. And if you're not thinking about it in the whole consumer journey, then you're probably missing a big part of your audience.
Yeah, agreed. We have the same conversations on a weekly basis at Textnow as we start to grow. Is do we put a more broad awareness on television? Do we put more into search for acquisition and
right.
Just kind of an of a conversation that is always ongoing.
Yeah.
Could we spend a minute talking about LendingTree real quick? You are relatively new there,
Yes.
but would love to hear. And I think the best part about going into a new job is that you assess and you analyze what someone is doing well. And then you also think about where's their opportunity. And so are you able to talk about things that you think that they're doing extremely well and then an opportunity that you are excited to help with?
Yeah, well, so I'll answer it two ways, but I will give you an answer. I'll talk about all things we're doing well. To your point, I'm here 30 days. I think it's the start of week 3, and so and we had a town hall yesterday, and I asked the same question, like what opportunities you see. I think one of the mistakes leaders make when they walk in a door is quick judgment or a quick assessment or quick commentary on what they're doing wrong. By the way, I've walked into many organizations where it's like, yep, that's probably not optimal. But I think there's some like nice way to sort of endear the team that's been doing this work for so long that you don't just step in on that. Because by the way, I've often found that only a small percentage, you're only right about a small percentage of those things. Like I've walked into organizations where it's like, that doesn't seem like the way most organizations are doing it or best practices. And then you sometimes find out that there's some complete random reason why it's happening that way. So it's not that people don't want to do things a certain way or do things up to best practices. It's a CEO decision sometimes it's a technology decision. So I can at least say off the bat that in terms of things that we're doing really, really well, there's a deep understanding of the consumer. We've done a lot more work to get to know the consumer a lot better in this changing environment. And that was sort of the underpinning of the TV campaign, was the research that we had done to learn more about this consumer. And so, and sort of what help they need to make these decisions. But I do think that historically we've had a good handle on our consumer. We've understood like where to push forward on in terms of opportunity, where to pull back on. We've understand when and when not to use data. I mean, the thing about direct response sort of advertising is you were driven a lot by performance numbers, or just numbers in general, and that's not a bad thing. I mean, when I took my first client side job at Comcast, I remember people from the agency calling and asking like, "What's the biggest difference?" And there was a few, but the most striking one is you talk about the numbers every day. And so it's not to disparage any other companies out there, agencies, publishers, platforms, but when you're a client, like you talk about your numbers every single day because they literally drive how you pay all of your bills. And so for LendingTree, what I have found is there's a lot of conversation around the numbers, and and what's happening now with leadership that's coming in is there's a good, healthy debate on how much can you push brand message without sort of upsetting that balance. And it's not to say that we won't push forward on things. We want to push forward on it thoughtfully, because look, the last thing we want to do is say, hey, you know what, let's take 40% of the budget and put it here. It's untested, it's unproven, but it's brand focused, and we want to build this brand. And then all of a sudden see performance crater. Like that's not the way to do it. So I think that's a lot of the stuff that we're doing well. I think search is another big, strong component for us. What we're doing with our media partnerships, with our display performance, there's a lot to be done there. I think to flip to the other side. So, what do I think? I think what I can say, openly probably isn't the right word, but is every organization I've come into, there's been, I'd say 2 to 3 things that like off the bat, you can look at and evaluate and find opportunities to drive more effectiveness. Like one is frankly just like organizational design. And that's not about reorgs. It's just, how are we working together? Like, how are we coming together? How are we sharing information? If you have an agency involved, how much are you bringing them into the conversation? Are you giving them sort of, because I will say, coming from agency side also over my career, like sometimes you're only as good as your client will let you be. And I've always said, I did get a lot of heat for being the in-housing person for a little while. But I always maintained that part of the problems for agencies is the client, because we don't want to pay for strategic resources. We want cheap media. We want you guys to be really efficient with what you do. We may or may not share all the data we have. And so how could you be expected to do a world-class job when you have half the information and a third of the budget? So that being said, I think first is in those ways of working, who's got decision rights, who's making decisions on things, where are we putting the money? I think that's one big bucket I always see. The second is, when you are client side, you're sort of insulated to your category. You're insulated to your category. Yes, you're learning. Yes, you're reaching out. You're attending Brand Innovators events. You're doing these kinds of things to learn more. But sometimes you're focused on what your category and what your team has been doing. And so sometimes you either haven't met with certain partners, you haven't tried things. You've tried something 3 years ago and it didn't work, and there's nobody to champion trying it again because everybody's still here. And so I always love when new people join the organization, because I always feel like hey, like, what have you done? Like, you've done something that we didn't do, and I want to hear how it worked. And maybe it's good and maybe it's not good, but let's sort of talk through it. So I think that's the other one. And I think the third thing is the partnership mix. So the sort of, who are we using? How are they performing? What are we missing from some of these things? And then lastly is probably around data and measurement. And I will say, I just can say pretty confidently, I'm not as concerned about that here, but I've walked into lots of places where, I mean, specifically, at Bayer and at J&J, I think a lot of our decisions for being so heavily linear at the time was based on data that we didn't have about digital performance. And then once we started implementing things like multi-touch attribution and more aggressive media mix modeling, we learned that actually, like, digital was driving significant performance. And so funding started to flow that way, because then you could have a thoughtful conversation with a CFO to say, hey, I'm driving profitable results with this particular tactic, but you're funding at a third of what we could be spending. And then you really get at the heart of how to make change.
Yeah, makes sense. So let's talk about data a bit more. What would you say, as you've been on the client side, you've been on the agency side, what has been the biggest or the most impactful type of data advancement that you've really leaned into?
Well, I mean, some of it is going to be pretty standard, I think, from what other people will say. I think using targeting or audiences in a way that's indicative of the behaviors you're trying to push forward. I think over time, I've seen too many people spend time in, I might answer it a different way, but this is how I'm answering it. Tell me if it's right or not. And so there's a degree of like, well, let's go after this audience, because this audience, the audience you're going after, and you go after these things that are broad in nature and sort of make sense, but they're not as close to trying to get to the desired impact. So when you really think about it, I guess the way to boil it down is like, what data signals can I take in that will tell me that this person is as close to a decision and in the category I want to be in as possible? So things like loves to travel, enjoys music, has gone to an outdoor concert, like that's really nice, but that's a lot of people in the world. And I'm telling maybe post-COVID, those numbers change, but like pretty much that's what people like to do. And so I try to focus on staying away from sort of more of those like higher level affinity metrics and look more towards kind of metrics that actually show an impact or an action. So whether it's purchase signal, whether it's a consumption signal of a platform. I made the comment about outdoor events, but if I sell a product that actually is like, if I sell a bug spray, I kind of want to target people who are going to outdoor events. So I think you have to get closer to the data signals that give you some belief that A, they're in my category, like they want to buy my product, and B, they're inclined to. So we spent a lot of time in consumer health looking at it wasn't contextual in the way you and I have been talking about it. It's sort of contextual of, well, like I make an allergy product, so I should probably buy WebMD's allergy section. And while true, because I think people who are WebMD probably are not prone, but predisposed to maybe taking a medicine, they might not be. And so like, I think it's more effective if I start looking at people who have purchased a product or purchased a competitor or purchased in the category and have they purchased from a Walmart. Like if I look at those signals, I feel like that gets me closer. And so I can be more efficient that way because I don't have to make a direct deal with WebMD, but I could also be more effective because I'm getting someone who, again, has exhibited a behavior that tells me they're in my category and they want to buy.
Yeah. Okay. So you actually just mentioned something that I think is, everybody has a different opinion on this, and I would love to hear the opinion from an expert like yourself. We have so much data at our disposal. When is there too much data? So for instance,
every day.
So is it best for a marketer to kind of just, let's call it buy contextually, or is it best for a marketer to pay an extra dollar on the CPM for that, like outdoors, pay an extra dollar for people that are men, pay an extra dollar for people? And so all of a sudden your CPM goes from, let's call it an average of $2 or $3 to about 15 or 20 for this micro niche segment. When is that too much?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple of threads to chase out on this one. It is a good question. I do think it's something a lot of people struggle with. So first off, I think that anybody that's in broad reach categories, so consumer packaged goods, consumer health, I'd even never throw automotive and travel in that. I think a level of targeting that doesn't get you to be so narrowly defined to like left-handed women who do yoga. Like, I think that's probably your sweet spot. So have to have done business travel, have purchased a product, have a certain number of people in the household of a certain age. Like, I think there's something to that I think is effective and powerful. And to your point a little bit, as you touched on contextual, I do think I think contextual works. I think contextual always worked. We just didn't have the measurement to prove it out as well as we do now. And because I do think that, this is, I think, what you were alluding to when you said earlier, like there's a tremendous amount of iconic historical brands that people love and consume every day that were built on a TV, print, radio model. Right, like that's just true. And what did they do? They went on soap operas and magazines and newspapers in categories that their consumer was in. Right, so like I was Nike and I'm selling a running shoe. Well, I would buy Runner's World magazine, and that makes sense, But I think we got into this world of like, oh, but you could find that runner everywhere, and that is absolutely true. But I don't think you ignore this thing that happened over here, because at some point, again, between accuracy of cookies, between fraud, viewability, all these things, you start to realize that like we might have swung too far to one side. So overall, I think it starts with who is that consumer and how deep down the niche do you need to go. I think especially in the pharmaceutical space, I think in certain sort of fitness categories, I guess automotive, even though I said it was in the other category, it could fall into this one. You've got a specific consumer in mind, right? Like if you want to buy like an electric vehicle, like there are some insights that'll get you down there, and it's worth paying more because the payout's more. And I guess that's my second thread that I was talking about is like, what's the payout model and what's the return?
Mm-hmm.
We knew there was a CPM that you could pay and be profitable, more or less. And over a certain point, it didn't matter. So like, I don't care how high end the placement was. I don't care how great your audience is. It is a business aspect to it. And I think that is the major thing that stuck with me from the second I left the agency to going client side and then going back to agency and back to client side, is that the understanding of how a business actually runs is so critical to what you can do for a company. And I say that because you start to understand that I can't pay a $20 CPM and turn a profit on my product. And so like, again, it's great that you're impactful. It's great that you've got great reach. It's great that you have an audience of people with kids in the household that make over $100,000, but I can't make money off $20 CPM. So it either becomes like, you shouldn't call on me anymore. And I say that nicely, by the way. I just think it makes sense. Or it becomes,
which is helpful to sellers.
Yeah, right. Which by the way, again, I blame clients. I am one again, like that we don't do that sometimes. Like there's a math equations that goes through all of this, and it shouldn't be as rigid. And it just means that there's a percentage of my budget that I can't give you because I can't make that profitable. If I'm launching a new line extension, if I'm launching a new product, if I'm launching a TV campaign, I will spend out of that range, because going back to what I said in the beginning of the conversation, I'm measuring those things differently. Right? I'm measuring those things on reach and awareness and brand equity and those kinds of things that are just different. But if I'm looking for what's going to drive sales, there's a math measurement piece in place where data will price me out.
Yeah, makes sense. Also very nice to hear that type of intel from the client side as well. So thank you for that. So we're a little over halfway through. I want to focus. So we talked about what we're doing well with data currently and how we best apply data. Let's talk about what's the plan B, right? So we're about to shift to a world where Apple kicked things off already. They pulled cookies, they pulled the mobile device IDs. Google is saying that this is about to happen at some point next year. We'll see if it really does happen. Fingers crossed it does not, right? But so what I've started to think about, what I'm tasked with, is how do we protect our future revenue and how do we gather as much first-party data as possible, right? So a couple of things just to kind of throw out there, and I'd like to hear your thoughts. We don't focus as much on Apple and iOS. We focus more on Android. We can monetize much better, right? But now we're thinking about if Google goes away with the device identifiers and they go away with the types of data that you would get, what is more valuable? How do you think about that? So have things like that already started being discussed at LendingTree, and then you've been hearing that discussed at different industry topics?
Yeah, I think in general, and I'm sure there's a follow-up here, like in general, yes. I mean, the idea of building out your first party data and creating lookalikes around that, that is something like that. First, that's something companies should have been doing forever, but I understand why you might not have. The reliance on third party made sense. And by the way, there's only like the one that, it's I hate to keep going back to the consumer health category, but it's just so perfect when you think about this. Like, you don't want a relationship with your pain reliever. You want to know a little bit about it. You want to know how much to take. You want to know if it'll make you sleepy. You want a coupon. Like, it's not, I don't need this. So the fact that consumer health companies historically, I'm talking broadly about the category, typically don't have giant databases of first party data it makes sense if you really think about it. Typically what they have is a lot of people who like coupons. And I'd argue that's probably not your top consumer. You know what I mean? Like when you're talking about a $12 bottle of a pain reliever, Like that's not someone, like someone who's going to spend that money doesn't care. I mean, everybody cares about a dollar saved, but when if you target your first party data strategy against a bunch of people who want coupons, I feel like you're going to hit the wrong consumer. So that said, I think there's a lot to be done in that space to keep growing and trying to get there. So my point is like, or my advice is like, where do you partner to get the signals and the data that you need to sort of build out what that looks like? Shifting over for a second. I mean, until Google literally turns off third-party cookies, I don't know that they're ever going to turn off third-party cookies. And it's one of those statements that like, I'm going to make, and then like, if I'm right, like you guys are gonna like, wow, he actually knew that. I don't think anybody's gonna say wow, by the way. But if I'm wrong, no one's gonna remember that I was wrong about it because the whole industry was wrong about it. But it just feels like, they're making positioning now to maybe break up the company a little bit, though I think their breakup of how they're describing it makes no sense at all, because looks like they're still gonna keep it under Alphabet. And that just seems like still the same company. So I think they're trying to make some concessions. I think no one will admit it, but I think there's some underlying, no one will say it out loud, hope that unified ID grows to a way that can be competitive with them. And then people stop sort of paying attention. I think they have so much money to pay the fines that, not that anybody wants to pay the fines, but I think if you think about the world that gets wrecked for them when they pull that out, I think it's just it's not in their best interest. Like this was like phasing out third-party cookies was about risk mitigation. It wasn't about anything else. And that's fine. Like you should make decisions off of risk mitigation. Like I would never want to be sued. If I could do something to not get me sued, I would go do that. But I think that, so my point is that all that said, the world and the accuracy of third-party data was okay. And when you factor in, like you just described, you factor in mobile devices, Safari, Firefox, like there's not a ton of it out there anyway. And I say ton, relatively speaking. So I think that the more you can partner with companies that have accurate identity-based data on their sites, the more that they have consumer data that they've taken in, that they can say, hey, like we're able to sell this to you. The retail media networks, I think this is why they're thriving so they're not so well, they're thriving right now. I would love to figure out how I could use them because I don't sell a product in a retail environment, but like they have the real data. Like they literally know it's me. I was in the store. I bought AA batteries and like, here's the other things I bought. So I think all those pieces coming together are where you have to come up with your identity solution.
Okay. So like a prediction here, we all can't predict the future, but we all have our opinions. And I appreciate you sharing your opinions early on. Are we going back to more on the contextual side? So again, if you're Nike, you happen to sell running shoes, we should buy ads in a running magazine. Or is it now going back to publishers and content owners are king that have zero and first party data?
I think it's somewhere. I don't think we're going back to a world of contextual, though or pure contextual, but let me just say this out loud. Like, I think and you and I made this joke, if you're old enough, you understand that like you've seen the ad that's like, this is not your father's Oldsmobile. And because it's like Oldsmobile was this like old car. And if you were young and hip, you would never drive it. The reality is that it was absolutely your father's Oldsmobile. I don't care what they changed it to look like. The fact that it's called Oldsmobile, it's old, like it's in the name that it's old. I hope nobody from Oldsmobile is on the phone, but I don't think it exists anymore, so it doesn't matter. That being said, like, I think contextual has matured so much and can put in a good amount of data that it's better than what it was. And so I do think there's lots of good reasons to want to use them. So I'm not saying don't use them, or I'm not saying don't think about contextual, but I don't think we're swinging all the way back in that direction. I think though you'll see healthier investments go that way because there's a combination of, we have first party data on our users, we have relevant content to them, and so we would like to have them. I'm sorry, you would like to reach them. I think their issue. I think providers in those situations are always going to just struggle with the cost model. Like how expensive are you compared to what my metric is? So that's one thing. I think it's partnering with people who have, yes, if you have device, if you have consumer information, if you have identity information, I think partnering with more of those companies, I think is helpful. I mean, we're not getting away from Google and Facebook. I mean, it's kind of impossible. Though I will say, like, from what I've heard, some of where the CPMs are going and some of the targeting is going, it's becoming less effective on some of those channels. But I think what I'm hoping for is that your marketing mix will get broader. And so if you look at the total share of money in this whole like duopoly thing, or I don't know how many opolies we have at this point, like, I don't think that ever completely changes. But when you think about so many companies that are so heavily invested in the Google, Facebook, Amazons of the world,
Mhm.
I don't know that number ever changes by sheer volume, but I would love to, but I do think that you'll see more and more companies that if you dug into like where your percentage of spends are going, those are going to become more diversified. So in totality, like, yeah, those numbers will still seem insane for what those three partners get. But when you start to break down like where companies are going, I do think more and more companies are going to find ways to spread their investments out, because they have to find those audiences, and they also have to figure out the right cost model to back into what they need from a performance standpoint.
Yeah. I mean, we've already started to see that, right? It was the percentage that would go was, I think it was 3 or 4 years ago, we were close to 80%, slowly starting to creep down. And this company is there for a very good reason, because they perform and they have this incredible plethora of data. So speaking of, let's call it the publisher and the marketer, trying to build out their first party and their zero party. Two of us talked about reasons that a consumer would actually hand their data over and why they do it happily, right? So on the Textnow side, we are providing an essential tool. We're giving them their phone for free.
Right.
In exchange, we are going to gather some types of data, and we're going to ask them questions, and our users happily give it to us. And it's the same at LendingTree, right? You are doing the competitive bids for them, and you are finding them the best and the most cost-effective product. If we think about, is that more of the future, that the consumers are now willing to give out data if there's a benefit? So do companies need to have some kind of value exchange to really build out their data set?
Yeah, I think it's very interesting, because there's this combination of like what makes headlines versus like what's really happening. And there's also, and then I think there's two other things at play. There's a generational dynamic. And then there's also, well, let me start with that piece there. So I think the first thing is the quickest answer, most straightforward, is yes. I think yes, information for value exchange, and also frankly information for like I need to submit this information. Like we need specific information in order to give you what you asked for. So so when I think sometimes of value exchange, I also think of 50% off my first order. Like, why wouldn't I just give you my email address? I could unsubscribe later. But that's a value. It's definitely a value. There's some stuff that's less value exchange and more of like, I need this to get my answer. And then maybe I'm just like splitting hairs on the value piece. But my point is like, if you're a company who is in the business of being able to provide solutions to a consumer, and you can gather as much information without overstepping, and overstepping really in terms of like hurting your conversion. So like, this, I'm too new to make an example here, but I don't know if there's probably questions in everybody's, forms. I'm not speaking specifically about LendingTree, that do you need that piece of information or do you not? Right? Do you need certain, and so if you don't need it, don't ask it, because while you might eventually want to sell that data down the road or use it for targeting, like you don't want to ask the consumer for too much that they're like, why am I giving all this information for?
There's user fatigue.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, so actually I can say at Comcast, like we were very vigilant about like, what questions do we need just to get you cable? Like, do we need your social security number? Like we actually did, because we had to run a credit thing and there was a whole like back and forth. But so we made a call out on the form to say, here's why we need this, because we were finding people were leaving there. Do we need your date of birth? I don't know if we needed it or not. Like maybe we don't need it. Like if the person can buy cable and they have a credit card, but I think at some point you have to be a certain age. So my point is more of like, ask the right questions that can give you that information, and that builds you up to be a good first party provider, or like you and I were joking about the zero party data people. So I think the value exchange happens in those two places, and the more you can gather that in, the better. I think you just have to balance that line of how much is too much.
Yeah. Okay. So we've got about 5 minutes left. Again, if you have some questions, why don't you type it in? So first question could be, what is an absolute must on the client side? You start to think about data. What's a nice to have, right? And then this is a must.
In terms of, you're talking about for like who we're trying to, well, it's interesting. I mean, I wouldn't
say for LendingTree in particular, I would say more in general on the client side when you're formulating a data strategy.
Yeah, I would say yes. Broadly, I think broadly the must have is some level of intent signals that are true to what your product is. So, and just like what I was saying earlier, like not do they like music and do they like to travel, but have they done X? Have they exhibited a behavior that says that's what our consumer does? Because the other thing about clients that I think sometimes folks miss is like, we do a tremendous amount of research on our consumers. Like companies that would come to us, especially in the consumer health world, and say, oh, like we could help you run like user surveys and panel data. Not to take anything away from those things, but we spend an inordinate amount of money on like researching this consumer and like what are their triggers and what do they do and why do they buy us over the competition. So my point is more that like where you could help is in helping us understand, like, wait, your users do these 3 things. We have data that says these 2 things that match up to yours. And so it's a viable user. So in the most oversimplified example, it's, purchase behavior. If you purchased a pain reliever in the last 30 days, you're probably going to purchase it again. So let's reach out in that regard. I think that's some of the things that you're looking at, is really those intensive. I think that's really a must have. I think also any sort of qualifiers depending on the product that you have, like, can they buy the product? So if you're an auto manufacturer, like, do they fit into the category where they actually could buy this? If you're a home buyer, like, can you actually purchase that home? I think those are the kinds of things that are useful, because you don't want to have too much waste against an audience that's just never going to qualify for the product.
Yeah, makes sense. So that question actually just led to 2 additional ones. So the first one being, how much do you know about real-time in-session behaviors? And then can you actually see, so you and marketers in general, and then the follow-up to that, can you see and react to people that are undecided or have abandoned the cart?
Okay, so yeah, by the way, are these questions coming from the audience, or this is your question? Oh, nice. Thank you, audience. So I'm going to answer broadly. I will say, like, we see companies like LendingTree do see real-time data, but as you can imagine, again, a consumer submits a form, and then we match them with lenders. We help them make a decision. So by the time all that, so it's not as immediate, because there's obviously a lag time between in which you submit an application, you find a lender, you actually go and get a loan secured. My point is that for most partners, that what I would refer to very broadly or very crudely as, like, who own the cash register, like, you see things in pretty good real time, and you can actually make responses and changes based on that. I mean, I always argue, or caution, not argue, I always caution that, like, don't make changes so quickly. Like, if you see things dip day over day, like over last week's numbers, like, don't be so quick to all of a sudden change your entire strategy or put more money into search because it popped last week. But there's a lot that can be done if you have that information. If you don't own the cash register, so if my product is predominantly bought in a store or through a third party that then has to pass me back data, it takes you a little while to make those decisions. It could be anywhere from 6 weeks, 3 weeks. It could be after the campaign, and it's too late to make changes, and you just have to sort of apply those changes in the future.
Okay. Thank you for that. Looks like that was the last question, and we are just about out of time here. So in the last 90 seconds here, Josh, I would like to hear, what do you think is overrated? What do marketers pay for?
LeBron James. Oh, sorry. Never mind. Let's see. Wait. So what I think is overrated from marketers?
Yeah, from a marketing perspective, something that costs a lot of money that a lot of marketers tend to invest in. What is not worth the major investment, or let's even call the smaller side?
Yeah. All right. So I'll say this with a caveat to it, because we've talked all about data and this data depravity and that's an advocate. So I think it's a broad principle. I think where marketers overpay for things are when they pay for things, and it could be anything. It could be a platform, it could be a data partner, it could be anything. But they pay for something without thinking through, like, what is the end game and how are we going to use it? So just for a quick historical background, I'll get it in before the end of the time, and I know they won't cut me off anyway. So I've over my career, I've worked with lots of people who wanted to get to some data or to some piece of information or bring on a partner that, by the way, was probably the right thing to do. But given where we're as an organization, how our bandwidth, trying to get buy-in, I didn't know there were times where I had to make a decision to say, I don't think we need that now. And so I think the biggest thing for if you play out that thread of what do we need and what do we not need is what do you need to run the business, make meaningful changes, and get meaningful information to actually drive those decisions. What is nice to have beyond that? But if you're going to take on anything, I think the question is less about cost. It's more of what are we going to do with that? And are we equipped to do it? So one thing I will say, a lot of platforms would come and say, hey, we've got this great platform. Here's what it could do. You can use it. But I'm understaffed. I'm never going to be able to use this thing because I'm understaffed and I can't use it. So I think there's some degree of understanding, but I've seen people make the mistake of taking on that platform and then realize, has anybody used this platform that we pay for, that we license? No. And by the way, once again, not the platform's fault. It's ours.
We're all guilty of this.
To do it. Right. Exactly. So that's my answer.